Hello, hello. Welcome back. It's time for another episode of Leading Women in Tech. I'm your host, Tony Collis, and today we're talking disruption, AI, what it takes to be a great leader, and so many more things. Today, I'm joined by Charlene Li. She's an expert at business transformation strategy. She's also the award-winning leader of 6 best-selling books, and she's working on her 7th. In fact, I think at the time this goes live, her book will have just been published. So look out for that one in the show notes. And she, in her most recent book, is talking about the role of AI in our leadership. And that's what we're diving into in this episode. And you'll notice the episode title here, Run to Disruption. And that's really what this episode is all about. How you as a leader need to be more disruptive, how AI can help you be disruptive. We even had a talk about the problem with today's layoffs being mismanagement. And I argued a lack of disruption. The AI world that we're now moving into is the biggest thing that we've had potentially ever, but certainly since the invention of the internet. And we need to be utilizing it. But so many of us are thinking bottom up rather than top down. And the conversation with Charlene is really about challenging how you're thinking as a leader about AI. It's about how we can become AI first and AI ready companies rather than how does AI make us more efficient? How does it replace our teams? That's bottom-up thinking, not top-down thinking. We also had a beautiful discussion about kind disruption and focusing on culture for disruption rather than tech for disruption. And I just think this is such a beautiful way of approaching the way we change the world and something I would like to see more of. So if you're interested in how AI can make you a better leader, how to leverage AI as a leader, how you need to be making sure the top 2 levels of every company are AI leadership literate, as well as your own personal AI strategy and the way it needs to change how we're working. And make sure you remain for the rest of this episode as we dig in to your leadership, your disruption, and the power of AI. Welcome to the show, Charlene. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. I can't wait to dive in because you are a lady that's passionate about AI. But before we go there, tell me a little bit about you, your career journey, the highlights, those very important lowlights, and why you are so passionate today about making sure we are using AI to be better leaders. Something I've not heard many people talk about. It's all about AI to be more efficient, but to be better leaders, it's different. So tell us your journey.
Well, I came out of Harvard Business School in 1993. And unlike my classmates who went into consulting or investment banking, I went to go work for a newspaper because I could see that the internet was coming and was going to disrupt things. And probably newspapers would be one of the first businesses disrupted. And I believe in the role of the free press for democracy. So I want to say, how do we make this business model work? And so very early on, got my hands really dirty and deep into this whole world of technology-driven disruption, and became a few years later a analyst at Forrester Research, where it was my job to talk about all the disruptions happening. And then in 2008, I wrote my first book called Groundswell about how companies can use social media. And then at that point left Forrester, started my own firm, Altimeter Group, and ran that until 2015 when I sold the company. And recently just went back on my own again, going back to my entrepreneurial roots. And so along the way, a lot of highlights. I've written 6 books, working on my 7th one about generative AI. And so those are the highlights. And the lowlights were in 2014, 2015, just before I sold the company, I was writing another book and took my eye off the business and ran into cash flow issues, had to lay off half the company. It was a huge wake-up call that I just wasn't being on top of things and thought everything was fine, and then suddenly woke up one day and realized we were not fine. And so that was a huge learning moment for me. And one of the things I have been focused about is that it's not about the technology. It is about the people. And when you can focus on the people and the transformation, and that is my key reason why leadership is so important. You have to have leadership. You have to have culture in order to drive disruptive change.
You really do. I think the word disruption is really key there, because I know when we were talking before we hit record, you mentioned about how your career has been about disruption. Why is disruption important in our roles as leaders? What role does disruption have in our careers? And would you do anything differently with your history around disruption?
Well, I think disruption is important because as leaders, our job is to create change. Leaders create change. They see something that needs to happen and they make it happen. It's not about your title. You can also just be a manager in your role where your job is basically to maintain the status quo. So you have to decide, are you going to be a manager in your role or are you going to be a leader in your role? You can be both. There are times when each will be required. And the reason why I think being disruptive leaders is important is if you're not willing to step forward and take on disruptive, hard change and just do the easy changes, you're not going to get very far. I believe there are so many things that have to happen in this world, so much potential for ourselves, for our organizations, for our communities, for our families, that we can't sit back and say, we're going to incrementally get to the place we're going to be. We need to disrupt our way to that future.
It's actually really interesting because also, the time we're recording this, 2024, there's loads of layoffs. And one of the conversations I've been having with some leaders, and some of them who've been laid off and some of them who are involved in laying off team members, which is the hardest thing, and you mentioned laying off, is like, why is the layoff happening? And one conversation I keep having is, if you're doing a layoff, it's because something's not working and you need to take big, bold action. And so many companies are we just need to downsize. We just need to save money. We need to cut costs. We're going to do a layoff. We need to save 10%. So we're going to shave 10% of our workforce off. That isn't normally 10% of your revenue, your outgoings, but we're going to shave 10%, whatever it is. And I keep saying to people, you're not changing things. What you're going to do is just reduce your productivity, probably by more than the percentage of staff you're reducing because of morale will go down. You're not being disruptive. They're not taking big, bold action to fix the issue. Would you agree with that? Do you think in this era of layoffs that being disruptive is the change that we need to fix these issues?
Well, I don't think that disruption and layoffs are necessarily have to go hand in hand.
I don't think so at all, no.
Right. And so the biggest reasons why we have these layoffs is mismanagement. I completely own the fact that I had to lay off people, and I had to lay off people at my previous company at Forrester 3 times. It is hard. And it's because we overestimate. We don't be cautious. We are trying to extend ourselves. And I'll give you an example of a company that did a layoff really well. A friend of mine was at a financial services company, and she was asked to take over a division. And her job was over the next 18 months to shut it down. And they knew that we just didn't want to be in this business anymore. We're not confident we can sell it. So we just want to close it down, but we want to do it in a neat, orderly way. So she came in and she was very transparent. My job is to transition this entire organization into a new place. So I will tell you, be very honest with you. I will give you notice 6 months ahead of time of when you'll be going. We're going to do lots of retraining and placements, but it was done in a thoughtful, in a strategic way. Versus, you're going to get an email in the middle of the night and everything's going to be shut off.
Yeah.
And there's 2 very different ways to approach it. So I think we can think about disruption and we can think about change. And sometimes it's very, very hard change. And it takes a lot of courage to be able to say, this is the place we have to go. And we're going to do it in the most humane way possible.
And I think that's what I was trying to get at. And maybe I wasn't articulating it very well because, the layoffs are just something that's very top of mind right now for so many of us. A disruption can be nothing to do with needing to downsize. It can be you're trying to think differently as an industry. I think what you mentioned at the beginning that you can either manage or you can lead. And the lead is being disruptive. It's making hard changes. And what I'm really seeing, I guess, is a continuation of that mismanagement that led to the layoff in the first place, which is a lack of bold disruptive action. It's just, we're just going to continue. We've got to lay off some staff, but we can continue. And I see that as one of the biggest problems in the way we're currently operating as an industry is a lack of disruptive thinking and bold action. Would you agree?
I agree, because we're caught in this cycle of boom and bust, boom and bust.
Mm.
And again, I've been in the industry now for a very long time. Went through the dot-com boom, went through the recession. In fact, I started my company in the fall of 2008 as the recession was hitting. And one of the interesting things was we hit a very sweet spot around how to use social media to replace all the marketing dollars that weren't there anymore. And so we were growing like gangbusters in 2009 and 2010, when everyone else was like, what are we doing here? And so again, I think in every disruption, there is opportunity. We saw that with the pandemic. We saw many companies I'm just going to shelter in place, be like a tortoise, just protect. And others went, oh, there's pain, there's disruption, there's people in need. The need has always been there, but now it's shifted. I'm going to follow that shift. I'm going to go and disrupt everything that I do and go follow that. And they're the ones who end up moving faster, adjusting to the quote new normal, and thriving. So I'm all about disruption is going to happen with or without you. So if it's going to happen, and sometimes you may even drive it yourself, how are you going to prepare for the disruptions? Because it's always there. The opportunities are always there. How will you think about disruption in a very different way?
I think it's really interesting you mentioned using social media when everybody else was like, heads down, and you're like seeing this massive opportunity before. And I think we now go through the same thing. Like social media has really changed in the last couple of years. Like people are tired of it. The ads are just everywhere. So you can't advertise on social media anymore. And well, you can, but it's a lot harder than it was like 5 years ago to make money through advertising. But it's not clear to me we have the next thing. When social media came about and you could suddenly start being on there, the newspaper industry advertising was kind of dying out a little bit, right? I think today, the thing we're all talking about, and I know it's one of the things you're very passionate about because your next book is about using AI, is AI. So how should we be thinking about AI? Is this the next social media revolution? Is it a lot of people saying it's bigger than social media? Like I think it is. So what is AI in terms of how this is going to disrupt how we operate? What can we be taking from this revolution as leaders to move forward?
I think it's the biggest thing since the internet came around. And we had the opportunity with the internet. It was a slow ramp. It was a really slow ramp to get adjusted to it. And social media was a faster ramp. And this is so explosive. And it's that explosive nature of it, the accessibility of it, that anybody with a browser can just use it. This democratization of incredible power, and frankly, democratization of knowledge. And it calls into question now that if you are an expert on something, your value has diminished tremendously because I've got an expert in my pocket now who can tell me everything. And as a person who is an analyst, who's an expert, who is, out there doing work around expertise and influence, I had a oh my gosh moment when I saw this. I'm like, well, what am I now? Because I can just ask the AI to be me and it does a pretty decent job of answering questions as me. So as leaders, the two things to think about. First of all, the AI can do your job. They can manage your workforce. They can set goals. They can set performance, review performance, be a coach. It can do all those things. So what are you now? What's your role as a leader? It's no longer to have all the answers, because all the answers are in the AI. You're no longer an expert. So what you have to do is now ask really good questions to focus people on the change, on the disruption, to do things that they're not comfortable doing, that they don't know how to do, and to be that guide. Because it's not in the AI, it's new. And it's that, and make no mistake, the AI is really good. It is more empathetic. It is more fair than we could ever be. Again, depending on how we design it. So that's one thing. The other thing, as a leader and a manager of people who now have superhuman powers, what does that mean for us to lead them? And it's interesting, especially if you're in customer service or sales and marketing, the adoption of this is where it's really happening. So.
Well, I think that's really interesting in sales and marketing. I'm seeing across industry. I think it's fascinating how much engineers I know are using AI to write software, for example. Like I was seeing engineers write a week's worth of software in a couple of hours, and it's better quality with fewer bugs. You have to ask the right prompt so it doesn't make mistakes. And I think that's the thing, that's the danger, is you are now the quality control, and you've got to be aware of so much that's at a higher level, but it means our function has changed completely. And I think it applies to every aspect of life, actually. I see AI coming in to everything we do. But what I do see is people thinking they're being disrupted with AI when they actually aren't. So I'd like to just talk about that for a minute. Like, where do you see people thinking they're being disruptive, in particular with AI, but they're not really being disruptive?
Sure. Again, I think there's different levels of disruption. So even just using it to get some of your writing done, to help you create content. I talk to so many writers, and I'm a writer myself. I'm like, oh, I would never trust AI to do my writing for me because I'm a writer. I mean, if I let the AI write, then who am I? Again, calling up that existential question. And so that feels really disruptive to them, but it actually isn't. But it's that mind shift that has to change about what is my role. I can have AI do the heavy lifting of putting the words on the page, but I will always be doing the thinking. And even as I'm writing with AI, having it either draft things or just review things and give me feedback, it's making me think. And it's helping me refine. So the whole process of writing isn't just the actual words on the page. It's actually thinking through it as you put the words on the page. And so we think that that is disruptive. That feels very disruptive because the way that we do our work on a day-to-day basis, how we communicate, how we write, how we research, how we get feedback is going to completely change because we have AI tools now. The really disruptive thing is when we now start thinking about not doing those things anymore, but what are the new things that we can do? What are the new skills and capabilities and areas that we can move into because we don't have to do the heavy lifting anymore? That's where the opportunity is. And that's where people are not necessarily thinking yet because they're thinking about how do I be more effective? How do I be more productive? These are low-level use cases versus high-level strategic use cases to say, if I had a magic wand and I could get AI to do all these things, what new capabilities would we have? What new types of value could we create? What new businesses could we go and build? New customers we could serve? New needs and changes that we could make? That's the true disruptive thinking I think we need to get to.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I do agree with you on the heavy lifting piece. I certainly use ChatGPT all the time. And it does so much of my heavy lifting. I never get writer's block anymore. I write a lot of content. I'm always, outlining episodes on my podcast. Or, I need to write a complicated message to a client. And I'm like, how do I start this? Writer's block is just gone. If I don't know how to start something, pop over to ChatGPT, like ask it a question. Which brings me to asking questions. You mentioned they're kind of like a throwaway comment where it can give us feedback. And I think this leads us into a conversation we had before we hit record about having AI as a coach, which I know the coaching industry is very wary of. I'm actually embracing it. I think it's a great thing because I don't think it replaces coaches. I think what it's going to do is level up coaching which should happen anyway. There's a lot of bad coaching out there, in my opinion. But that whole feedback piece, having a conversation with AI, how does that filter into us as leaders? Like, what does it look like to use AI as a coach, as a leader?
Well, it can use it, again, as leaders, the number one thing to being coachable is to be self-aware, to say that I have an issue that I need to get addressed. And if you're so lucky as to have a coach, like you, Tony, then it's great. But oftentimes we don't. Sometimes it's a very small thing that we need coaching on. Sometimes it's a really big thing. And we may or may not have the right coach at that moment. And so what AI can do, you can tell it, I need you to be a coach, an expert on this thing, and help me think through this. So whatever is that problem, you can ask the AI to take on a certain role, give it the scenarios. You can even ask it to do a role play with you. Like, I need to have a very difficult conversation with somebody about something. I need you to coach me through this. Let's do a role play. And then at the end, say, what could I have done differently? What could I have done better? What was good about what I did? So that kind of feedback is so invaluable, and it's right there at your fingertips. But you have to know how to construct it. And I think that's the thing that coaches will add a lot of value, is that coaches will be able to construct that coaching AI for their clients, because they understand their clients. They understand how to create that. So sure, you could do it, but you're kind of behind behind everybody because you're doing it for the first time. A coach has done this hundreds of times, thousands of times. And they can do that directly with you or build an AI to give you exactly the type of coaching you need.
I love that. I was thinking, if we are using AI as a coach, I think it has to level up our responsibility in a coaching relationship. And again, I go to my own experience here as a coach and why I am so passionate about what my business does, because we have so many women that come to me saying, I've never had a coach that's understood me. I've never had a coach that is asking me these kinds of questions. Thank you. It breaks my heart. It makes me quite angry about the state of the coaching industry. And I say this as coach. It's why I train coaches now. I never thought I'd train coaches, but I do because I'm so passionate about improving coaching, especially for my audience, which is women in tech. But part of it is, I don't think we know what we should expect from coaching. And I think part of using AI to coach you has to be an awareness of responsibility. Because, we've all experienced, I'm assuming at this point, if you've used ChatGPT, you've experienced asking it a question and it coming back with a not very helpful answer, right? It's well-intentioned. I think ChatGPT is really good actually for something well-intentioned, but it sometimes just completely misses the mark. And I think this is the danger with coaching. With it, when you put complete trust in your coach, you're in danger of not realizing it's missed the mark, which is exactly the skepticism we need to have with AI as well. And I think if we're to use AI, it actually makes us better coachees, because we have to take responsibility. It's the same responsibility I advocate all my clients have. They get to disagree with me. They get to push back on me. They get to say, Tony, that's not helpful. I wish they did it more than they did. Because they are the expert in their precise field. I'm an expert at leadership. I'm an expert at being a woman in tech, don't get me wrong, but they are the expert in their specific role, not me. Would you agree with everything I just said? Do you think this makes us more coachable?
It does. And I think the biggest issue here is that AI doesn't mean that your critical thinking skills get turned off.
Yes.
If anything, they have to be heightened. And so what you're asking your coachees to do is to keep their critical thinking skills up to speed. That just because you're in the room doesn't mean they can have the permission to stop thinking. And it's the number one thing I tell people starting to work with AI is your critical thinking has to be at 100%, 110%, because your AI is going to give you stuff and it's going to sound really good. And they go, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. Double check that. We know that from the research also that if you tell the AI, be very careful with your work. Your answer is very important to me and it's going to make a big difference in my career, in my job, whatever. Ooh. Just tell it to be careful. It will be more careful. It's like
That's
having an intern or an employee, just like, when you do this work, be super careful and they will take an extra effort to be careful. Do not make anything up. Things like that.
I love that. I've not actually tried that technique, but it makes so much sense, right? I know that if you say please and thank you, it is more likely to give you useful results. And I always thank AI because it's learning from everything I put into it. I want to be respected, so I should respect the AI as well, which I think some people find really odd, but I just think that's like a necessary thing. Like, it's read the entire internet, most of these, and there's so much toxicity on the internet in the first place. If I can add my little bit of good quality behavior to improve it further, and that's just a good thing. So how can we actually go about setting up AI as a coach? You've talked about like roughly what we can do. Like, what can you give us some quick steps for this is how to set it up. Like, this is the questions I need to start with or the information I need to give it. Where do we start with that?
Well, let me just talk about the coaching, because it could be any sort of advice. It could be about a particular situation that you're facing at work with a tough person. It could be, how do I go about giving all this feedback to somebody? Am I giving appropriate feedback? So you can upload performance reviews. Again, making sure you're using a safe model, that you're not using the data to train the model. But you can put in a lot of information. I ask it to give me feedback on strategy plans, on marketing plans, and to use its expertise. And sometimes I give it entire brand guidelines to say, right with this, is it consistent with what it's doing? And so it's all about defining what job, the role of the AI, because it has the entire internet.
Yeah.
As you said, you only wanted to focus on one slice of it and be really expert on one slice of it. And so say, what is your role? Is your role as an executive coach for women in tech? Is your role as a person who deals with interpersonal conflict? Is your role as a good developmental editor or a copy editor? Two very different roles. And ask it for feedback and be very specific. What kind of feedback? What should it look like? How long should it be? How detailed should it be? Even what kind of tone it should take. So when I'm getting feedback on my writing, for example, I give the instructions, be kind. Your feedback. This is my baby you're looking at. Mm-hmm. So I just say, be constructive, be really clear about it. Don't hold back, but be kind. Like, don't say this is awful. Tell me it could get better. Things like that.
Constructive feedback, right? We're always after the constructive feedback. Well, okay, let's talk about your book for a moment, because actually, I think by the time this goes out, I think you'll have just released your book or about to be. And I know, although your book is about generative AI, it's, in your words, more about leadership. And it's creating our own personal leadership AI strategy. What do you mean by that? What is a personal leadership AI strategy?
Well, I think the biggest difference is that we talk about knowing about AI, using and doing AI, and then leading AI. And right now, a lot of people, a lot of leaders know about it. Very few are actually doing it and using it in a way that they feel that they have transformed the way they do work. And unless and until you experience that transformation, it's very difficult to imagine how it could transform your organization. And so one of the top things we encourage with the book is that you train your top 2 levels of leadership to be highly AI literate, meaning they understand the power of it. They're using it to really change the way they're doing work. They don't have to completely give themselves over to AI, but they need to understand at a visceral level, at a personal level, what the power of what AI can do. Then they can think about, oh, if it changed the way I work, this is how it could change the way everyone in the organization works. And that's when you can start thinking strategically versus, oh, we can use it to write marketing copy. Oh, we can use it to answer a few agent calls in our call centers. Yeah, it can do that. But how does it roll up into something that's meaningful, that's going to impact the organization? And that is the role of leaders, to think about how it's going to impact themselves and also their organization.
I really love that insight, because you're right. There is such an emphasis at the moment on what I'm calling bottom up, right? It is how, oh, look, we can use AI to write marketing copy. We can use AI to write software code. There isn't top down. And I'm seeing this in some of the big companies I'm talking to, where they're all like, we need to use AI more. This is really exciting. And they're expecting their teams to just magically generate ideas for how to use AI. It's not strategic. They think they're being strategic because they're saying, let's use AI. But there's no real understanding of where to bring AI in. It's push downwards, which means the ideas that then come back up again aren't balanced with the strategic imperatives of the company in the right way. So I really love this idea of like, train your leaders to use AI every day, just so they think differently. And this brings us back to probably the internet era, when the internet first became a thing, or even just emails, right? You think about when we first brought email. I'm definitely showing my age here. When we first started using emails, and there were people who would still send faxes and paper memos, and they just couldn't get on board with emails. And it was The companies that did really well is when the leadership adopted emailing and it came down. The companies that struggled were the ones where the leadership didn't get on board with it. And it was all coming upwards. And it was a constant fight from below. And that's such a small thing in comparison to AI. Adopting email is such a tiny thing, right? I still get messages today from people saying, have you got a fax number? I'm like, what century are you living in? Who has a fax machine anymore? And I think this is the same thing. If the leadership, which typically is older and therefore most stereotypically less likely to adopt technological change, if they don't know what AI is capable of, how can they expect to make good strategic decisions? Is that where you're coming from here?
Absolutely. And this has been the case with any sort of technologically driven change, digital transformation, mobile, cloud, social, the internet itself, e-commerce, self-service. The list goes on and on and on. And there's always a curmudgeon someplace crossing their arms and saying, you go first. I'm going to wait until the very last minute to change because I just like the way I do things around here. And frankly, in my research, that exists in every single generation.
Yeah.
And you also have these, what I call realist optimists who like, oh, I think this technology is great. And they'll be the first ones to line up. And again, it is consistent across generations. The issue is that we have more older people in leadership positions. And so they tend to want to maintain, again, the status quo because they're managers, not leaders. So the way I think about it is, at some point, a leader needs to stand up and say, we're going to become AI first and AI ready. I know this one CEO who said, a company about 600 people said, we're going to do this. We're going to give all of you training, all of you access to the tools. If there isn't a tool that you want to use, then let us know. We'll go through and improve it. And we're going to have a dashboard for everyone. And everyone's going to have a light next to a little light color. You're going to be green if you're actively using these tools. Great. Awesome. Yellow. You haven't quite figured it out, but you're trying. You're experimenting with it. You're in there. You're in the mess. And red, you're not doing anything at all. And then he said something very interesting. He said, in 6 months, there would be no more red lights at this company. And what he was saying is, we will be AI ready. We will be AI first. And that starts with us. It starts with you. So you can choose to become a yellow light. Just start experimenting with things. And you won't be a red light anymore. Or you can choose not to be here because this is not the place for you. And we completely understand that. Respect that. But we're going to give you 6 months. We'll find ways to transition you out of this role because we need you to be in this space. It's your choice. And I think it's that mindset that's going to be needed. When I tell that story to leaders, they gasp. And then I ask them, why are you gasping? Because you know you have to use these tools. You know this is the future. So what are you waiting for? Are you waiting for the technology to become what? Perfect? It's not going to happen. Are you waiting for something to, what are you waiting for? What is a sign that's a specific sign? What is the thing that's going to have that starting gun go off and you say, okay, now is the time. So my sense is now is the time. The tools are readily available. They're easy to use. There are some simple steps that you can take to stay safe. And staying safe is the number one reason why people won't go in. They have FOMO, fear of missing out. I want to get in. But they also have fogey, fear of getting in.
Yes.
Because what if I screw up? What if I mess up? What if I do something that's really bad? And this is where that critical thinking comes in. Nothing happens with AI until you decide to use the results out of it. So your critical thinking is crucial. If you can train people to trust that gut, to understand what's good, what's bad, how to use these tools, they will be fine.
I think you've hit something so fundamental there, which is just realizing, one, we're all going to be fine, but two, we have to do this. And we talked about disruption at the beginning of this. And I think that attitude of in 6 months, we are going to be AI ready. It's going to be no red lights. That is disruption. It's kind disruption, which I'm a big believer in kind and compassionate leadership. The mistake I think people make, and I certainly was this leader at one point, was compassionate leadership does not mean you put up with the red lights, because actually that's not compassionate to the people who are operating as green lights because they're dragging the red lighters along. being disruptive can be done with compassion, by training everybody, by giving them time, by saying, I'm going to give you an opportunity to move along with us here. This is the future. I want you to be with us for the future. But you also have the opportunity to leave. We're not just going to beat you out. We're going to give you time to make that decision. And that is so powerful as a way to be disruptive. Because I think sometimes we hear disruption and it feels very unpleasant. But you've just shared a story of kind disruption, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think, again, it's the best kind of leadership is the one that you are running towards. You want to be that leader. Mm-hmm. So the leader that you want to show up as are the best leaders that you've ever had an experience. And if you've only experienced the not so kind, hierarchical, command and control leadership, then that's the kind of leader you're going to be, versus if you've had a kind, compassionate, courageous leader who's able to drive disruption, you have those role models, or you read about them and hear about them, then you start thinking maybe things could be done a different way. And I think this is the interesting thing about women in leadership and women in tech in particular, because tech has its own culture. It has a certain way of doing things. And as a woman coming in and trying to disrupt it, it's so interesting to me that these companies that claim to be disruptive are themselves highly not disruptive.
Oh, yeah.
Are really, really rigid and very fragile. And so anything that upsets the status quo is really hard to do. And the reason is because everything is being held together in order to do the disruption outside in the market.
Yes.
And so there's no space and capacity to do disruption inside. And I think the best types of disruptions, when you're truly resilient as an organization and as leadership, is when you can do both. And they go hand in hand, and they're consistent, and they feel and sound the same, versus having this dissonance. We're disrupting outside, but we can't do anything inside.
Yeah. And it's that lack of self-awareness as well around that disruption internally. I find it astonishing. Like, I started my career working in universities and academia. And for an industry that is at the forefront of human knowledge, by definition, it is research oriented. It is the most antiquated culture you'll ever work in. And then I move into corporate tech, and it's a little bit better, but you are spot on that it's because we're creating this disruption externally. It's like we've got nothing left over. One of the things I'm trying to demonstrate by building my business the way I am is that we can be better leaders and still be profitable, not burn our teams out. We can build great companies that scale. That's my goal here. A great company that scales, that is doing things differently. Because I just think the tech industry needs more examples of this. And I hope all the women I coach go off and do the same thing. That's the goal. That's the big mission here, right? And we just have so little acceptance of doing things differently. And I think one of the things we've seen in 2024 with major layoffs and therefore fewer opportunities for potential employees is a contraction again in our culture. I think we're getting more bro culture. We're certainly going back to the office more. There's less acceptance of differing needs in terms of working environments. But it's this contraction in the culture and the lack of, therefore, disruption, because they're not being forced to anymore. Whereas we're forced to keep up with the technology because that's kind of the definition of the industry. Is that kind of what you're getting at here?
And I think that the difference is it's so competitive in tech that the really smart companies, the really smart leaders realize that they have to evolve their leadership and culture also to attract the top talent. The top talent isn't just going to go to you now because you have the hot new product, because it might not be in the hot new product next month. And we know that culture eats strategy for breakfast every single day. So if you have a great culture, then your strategy will evolve to meet what the market is doing. You could have a great strategy, but what happens if it's the wrong one? Can your culture actually help it evolve and follow the customers where they are? Product market fit is where it's all at. And do you have a culture that can pivot and adapt? Or do you need a culture that's going to persist at the right times too? So pivoting and persisting is what tech is all about, because it's changing so quickly. And the number one thing that companies and leadership be doing is focusing on culture. I can't say it enough. People ask me, what do we have to do to be disruptive? And I go, how's your leadership and culture? Like, no, that's not what we want. We don't know about the technology. And I go, the technology doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter because there's always this long gap between when the technology shows up and when adoption actually happens. So you could be a late arrival and completely decimate the market and completely run over it because you were adopted better and faster than everyone else, and everyone else has had the growing pains that they've had to suffer through. So it doesn't help to be first to market. If you are, great, but I wouldn't worry about it. And in tech, it's usually the third player entering the market who gets it right and explodes. If you look, it's consistently the third player. So it's never the first or second. Apple was never first or second. It was always third. And it just gives them the time for the market to develop, understand the customer needs, and then executes like crazy. So when I talk to tech companies and founders and large companies, I go, how's your culture? They go, it's great. I'm like, okay. Then we go walk around and talk to some people. And they get nervous.
Yeah.
And I go, can you tell me what your future is? What's your vision of what the future looks like? Who's your future customer? Can you tell me that? Can you tell me what your strategy is to meet the needs of those future customers? And then most importantly, can you tell me how you are personally helping the company achieve its strategy to meet those future needs? And here's the thing, every single person in your organization should be able to answer those three questions.
Yes.
Because if they're not focused on customers and the future customers, they understand what the strategy and what the role is. What are they doing coming to work every day? That is a leadership and culture issue. That is not a strategy issue.
I love that. I love that so much. I talk so much about how everybody in my company understands how their little contribution is contributing to our strategy. Otherwise, we aren't functioning as a company. And I wish more people understood that. I have one final question for you before we move to the quickfire round. Something that I'm particularly intrigued. I asked this for a lot of people, but I'm particularly intrigued what you would say here. If you could give your younger self advice about your road ahead, what would it be?
I think I would say be honest with myself. It's the thing that I've really been really focused on in the past couple of years. And I would say just be really honest. What is it that you want? What are truly your capabilities? It's one of the reasons why I really have made an effort on a regular basis, about every 12, 18 months, to take some time off, to evaluate where I am, to do the self-evaluations, to do lots of, go into coaching, have a retreat or something, to just center and then reorient to where I want to go. And so being honest in that process, like brutally honest with myself and having other people be really honest with me about what's going on, it would have been such a great gift to myself to have that ability to go and get that honest feedback is something I wish I had done much earlier and more consistently and been more thorough about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is the greatest gift somebody could give you is feedback.
Yeah. And self-feedback that's not overly judgmental or overly naive. It's a true gift. Well, let's move on to the quickfire round. I love these questions. So starting off, what is the worst piece of advice you've ever been given?
The worst piece of advice was to not take and pursue a public company board seat. I went and talked to some people who were on board, some key advisors of mine. And I was like, I'm thinking of doing this. What do you think? And they just went on and on about how terrible it is, how hard it is to be on public boards and everything, without thinking the fact that it's a woman and a woman of color and how important it is to get that first seat.
Yeah.
None of them said, well, it may not be the perfect board, but just take it as long as the things are work and everything, because that first seat is so important to you. And so worst advice, because I was a CEO at the time. Yeah, I was busy. There were potential conflicts that I had to work through. But the worst advice I got was to don't pursue those seats because it's too messy. Because it would have made a huge difference if I had gotten on one public board, because then it opens up all the doors.
Yeah, being on a board, I think, is so powerful. I've not been on a public board, but I've been on advisory boards. And I think they really open your eyes and they open your network as well. I think if anybody's listening, a board seat is a great thing for your career and your knowledge and everything else. But let me ask you your next question. What is the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
And this is very specific to women, and I'm very aware of the audience. It is to never work the third shift. And what I mean by that is the first shift is when you go to work. The second shift is when you come home and deal with everything else that's in your life, whatever it is, your family, your spouse, your friends, whatever. So doing all those things, right? And as a working mom that have worked through my entire career, and I try to work 45 hours a week, that was really hard. Okay. And my heart goes out to any working parent. It is just so hard and doubly hard for women. And the third shift is when you feel guilty about not having done a good enough job in the first and second shifts.
Oh.
So I got this advice before I even got married, is to never work the third shift, because whatever you are doing is the best that you can do. You are always giving the best. You are bringing your best to work. You are bringing the best to home. And at some point, I just said to myself, there is no such thing as balance. There is just a never-ending series of unfortunate compromises that I have to make. And so my best is all I can give. So I'm not going to feel guilty about that. I'm not going to work the third shift.
100%. I love that phrase. I love that so much because we spend so much of our energy judging ourselves and it's just not worth it. What is the last book you read and would you recommend it? And you are allowed to say your own book here, but I'll ask you for a second one as well. Because I'm sure like all the time reading your own work.
you can see my own books. The last book I read is a book I try to read every year. Is How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie.
Yeah, that's a great book.
I love that book. And it's great. I don't quite read it. I just go through it again and like read my favorite chapters or just skim through and like, oh wait, this could be really helpful. There's just so many good nuggets in there. And the thing that I was reminded is that to really connect with somebody, be genuinely curious about what's going on in them. And it doesn't matter what role they are, what, space they're in, but be really curious about who they are, what makes them tick, what they value, what's important, what's hard in their life right now. And it has really helped me just connect with people. And so it's one of those books. I have like a beat up copy and a clean copy, but I have two copies in different places. So I can just pick it up and just thumb through it because it's such a great reminder about how to not only be a great leader, but just how to be a great person.
Yeah, I've read that so many years ago. I actually need to get it back off the shelf. But it's one of those ones, it's timeless. It's really timeless, which we don't think of many old books that way, but I love that one. Thank you. I will make sure I link to that as in the show notes, as well as a link, I hope, to Charlene's soon to be published book. I will make sure that we get that in the show notes whenever that goes live. So listen out for that, people. But mindset is the final, well, not quite the final, but the final kind of top tip, I should say, from you. I love to offer everybody a mindset tip every episode. So what would be your favorite mindset tip for the women listening to this episode?
It is to change your mindset about disruption as something to avoid and something that you run towards. So run towards disruption. Go to the very edge of your comfort zone and push beyond it, because it's when we break out of our comfort zone, that's when we learn, that's when we grow. So I live by this every day. I try to find ways to disrupt my life, to have an adventure every day, to do something that feels a little bit risky. And when you build it into your everyday life, then disruption becomes easier across the board. I like to jump from high places like cliff diving and, bridges and, just like rope courses. I just love that whole adrenaline thing. And in the beginning, it was really hard. And now I'm like, I see a cliff, I want to jump off of it. So as long as I know I'm safe, that other people have done this and has those safety precautions, I'm like jumping all over the place wherever I can find something to jump off of. But when I take a new person to a cliff that I love doing, they're terrified. And I remember what that was like. And so as you build disruption into your life, then it becomes easier. And we need, I think, to be able to create and be comfortable with those kinds of big changes.
I love that. Thank you so much. This has been a fabulous conversation. So thank you for coming on the show. How can people find out more about you, find your book? Where can we find you online?
You can find me on LinkedIn, easy place to find and connect me. It's where most of my current content is being published. I have a newsletter on LinkedIn. I also have an email newsletter. And you can find all that information on my website at charleneli.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Charlene. I'd like to just ask you to leave listeners with a final thought from you. What do you want everybody to remember moving forward today?
I think every person has so much potential. And my whole purpose is to catalyze transformation for people to reach the full potential. And so really think about what your potential is and don't settle for anything less. Don't let anyone tell you that you can do less than what you think your potential is. And I just wish you all the best in reaching that.
Fabulous. Thank you. I think that is such a great sentiment to finish off with. Like, don't settle for anything less. What a great way to wrap up today's episode. So as always, listeners, remember, stay in your tech leadership game and follow your dreams. And don't settle for less, because the world really does need that uniqueness that you bring as a leading woman in tech.